Good afternoon, everybody. I think that we've had some wonderful conversations, and certainly the sessions which I've attended today have also been very, very stimulating. My name's Rosemary Lyster. I'm the Professor of Climate and Environmental Law at Sydney Law School. And I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which the University of Sydney is built, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. But I would also like us just to think about the many, many conversations that go on and have gone on amongst the traditional owners of the land about the very issues that we are discussing, environmental management and so on. So just to quickly go back, Robin, to your point, is that in 2013 I actually wrote an article on establishing a climate disaster response fund under the Warsaw Mechanism, and that's how Maxine and I met, because I published that on SSRN, and Maxine emailed me and said, wow, we're sort of working in the same sort of areas, let's meet. So, and that was published in Transnational Environmental Law Review, if anyone wants to read it, in 2015. Okay, so first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Chuks Okereke, who's an associate professor in environment and development at the Department of Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Reading. He's also the co-director of the University of Reading's Leverhelm's doctoral training program on climate ethics and justice. He also is a visiting fellow at the Smith School and Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute. Chuks was a lead author on the IPCC AR5 assessment report on equity and sustainable development. So I now welcome Chuks to the podium.
Thank you very much, David, for the invitation. It's a very privilege and honor to be here. I'm framing my talk around exploring what is the implication of the increasing polycentric climate governance, especially in the context of the Paris Agreement. So one of the key features of the climate issue is that the center of the governance of the issue, although very much located within the UNFCCC framework, is scattered all over the place. And so authors have been talking about the increasing polycentrism or fragmentation of the architecture of global governance. And what we see is that there is much more involvement of private sectors, of transnational collaborative initiatives, but also of multilateral and bilateral and sublateral domains of governance that are related to climate change. I'm going to look a bit backwards before I look forward. So there are three key point connections between climate and justice. And these three key connections lies in three asymmetries. Number one is asymmetry in contribution. The second is asymmetry in impact. And the third is asymmetry in the power to decide. First, in terms of asymmetry in contribution, we know that just about 20%, the 20 largest economies in the world are responsible for about 82% of global carbon stock. We know that the EU and the US, that comprise about 10% of the global population, are responsible for about 24% of global emission. Whereas Africa, which is home to about 20% of the global population, is responsible for only 3% of the global emission. So the fundamental question here is about asymmetry in contribution. The second is, By the way, I just put this slide to show that what obtains in the realm of climate change actually is also mirrored right across the general resource consumption in the world. So this same 20% of the global population is responsible for roughly 80% of the consumption of other global resources, whether you're talking about forest, wood, precious metals, cement, etc., etc. So this slide shows that if the whole world is to consume as much energy as we do in the United Kingdom, we will need about 8 or so planets. Surely we have only one planet, and so we really need to discuss justice around this issue of consumption. The second is a symmetry in impact, which Robin already alluded to. The fundamental challenge here being that those who are contributing the least to the problem are the ones that are bearing the biggest brunt. This raises a distinctive moral dilemma that the rich are imposing their risks on the poor. And what we see is that the most vulnerable, the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change are all countries that have contributed very, very little to the problem. But also that this is really very much an existential problem, as we've been hearing in the context of climate refugees and climate displacement. What this graph, however, shows is that there's almost a perfect correlation between GDP and vulnerability. And this graph is really important because I think it's one powerful way of framing the conundrum or the dilemma that we have. On the one hand, countries feel that they need to grow their economy in order to strengthen their resilience against climate change. On the other hand, doing more growth leads to more carbon emission, which leads to climate change. And then the third asymmetry has to do with asymmetry in ability to decide or participation. And what we have is that these developing countries who have contributed the least to climate change, who are bearing the greatest impact of climate change, are also the ones that have the least voice in the climate change negotiation arena. Now, this raises a distinctive possibility that those who have actually contributed the greatest to the problem can design policies that exacerbate the issue. And what this graph shows you is just comparing the number of people, delegates that come to COP meetings, the annual climate change meetings. And you can see, for example, Germany, roughly 80 million people, with Ethiopia, roughly 80 million people. 2000, 75 to 5, 56 to 3, 62 to 0, 101 to 2. And this does not include the German negotiators that are part of the EU. And so when you have just 2 people from Ethiopia trying to run around all the places to negotiate what is a very difficult and complex regime, you can imagine how John Dryzek would talk about the democratic deficit of this problem. So I'm not quite sure what Robin was saying about climate justice not having penetration and impact on the climate regime. If that's what you say, Robin, I would like to kindly disagree. It's a very risky thing to disagree with Robin. But you know, in his opening remark, Dave was talking about Hugo Grotius and how his professors was acting, trying to get him to do real IR. One of the fundamental theories of IR is that moral contestations are beyond the pale of international politics, I mean mainstream regime theory. But one of the things that gratifies my heart, well, up until recently, is that actually we have proven beyond all reasonable doubt that international politics is not beyond the pale of morality, and that climate change is a potent example for anyone who wants to make that case. We see, for example, a lot of provisions about climate change in the existing regime, and the first thing really is that it was equity concerns that moved global climate negotiations into the UNFCCC arena. Developed countries wanted to negotiate a much more narrow protocol, but it was developing countries that said, no, this has to go into the UNFCCC domain. And that quote from the Indian negotiator captures the sentiment of much of the developing country world. The idea was that negotiating climate change within the UN allows for these big structural questions to be had, because climate change was seen as one area to get into bigger discussions about how to redistribute wealth globally. Second quote from a negotiator in Pakistan makes the point that they felt, developing countries, that having this negotiation within the UN allows all countries to have a fairer ability to make their point. We also see contestations of equity really shaping the article of the regime itself. There was a lot of debate about having just the objective of the regime around greenhouse gas emission. But developing countries were able to broaden the objective for good or for bad to include ecosystem management, food security, and broader economic development. And then, when you talk about the moral norms actually in the regime, there's quite a lot, including the admission that the regime is going to be negotiated on the basis of equity and common but differential responsibility principle. There were other important norms like precautionary principle, per capita emission, a historic responsibility, and this admission that there will be new additional money flowing from developed countries to developing countries. And critically, that the commitment of developing countries depends very much on developed countries providing new additional money and also taking leadership. So now we've moved to a much more polycentric, bottom-up, for the want of better word to describe it, but I do agree with Robin that is a bit mischaracterization. But we've moved to a much more polycentric climate governance, and so what really does this mean for issues of justice and equity? And I think there are at least 4 points to be made. Number one, the issue of effectiveness. It has already been mentioned by Maxine that the total pledges fall far short of what scientists have suggested needs to happen in order to be on the pathway to 1.5, to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So there is this admission, of course, of sustainability, Mother Earth, human rights, and even some people will celebrate the inclusion of the 1.5 as a triumph for equity. But we do know that the totality of all the emission contributions fall far what is expected. And analysis have shown actually that this ambition gap very much represents a fair or equity gap in the regime. So what happens if, as we have moved now to this kind of more pledge and review system, nations are unable to meet their responsibility or the pledges are generally fall short of what is expected? What will happen is more climate change, and more climate change means more impact, more displacement, more refugee. So we have the problem of effectiveness. The second is the norm structure, which I think is quite important. Words do matter in international regime. And what we have is a diminution of this notion of common but differential responsibility. So as many of you will know, there are 3 key ways of actioning equity within the regime. One is burden sharing, which the best example is the quantified emission reduction obligation for the developed countries and the lack of quantified emission reduction for the developing country. The second one is litigation, which is basically problematic as we now have been hearing this morning. And then the third one is low carbon development. And really, what Paris has done is to diminish burden sharing and diminish litigation, and now moved all the eggs more or less into the basket of green growth. But that raises a number of challenges, because what now has to happen is that to fund green growth, the only way that justice can really be obtained is to ensure that a lot of money is being funneled to fund green growth. But again, as I think either Robin or Maxine has said, a lot of what is coming as part of green growth is really not additional. It's part of the existing ODA. A lot of the pledges are not being kept. And we also see that, for example, in Africa, 18 billion pledged, only 1.6 billion deposited, and actually 379 million is what is going to developing country. So my time is up, but I think the big point I'm making is that equity has now been kind of rolled back in the context of this new polycentric governance to, with implication of lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and also potent danger for the effectiveness of the regime. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chuks. Our next speaker is John Barnett from the University of Melbourne. John's a political geographer whose research investigates social impacts and responses to environmental change. His research has helped explain the impacts of climate change on cultures, food, security, migration, water security, and peace. He focuses particularly on adaptation solutions that contribute to social justice and peace. He's conducted field work in several Pacific Island countries and in Australia, China, and Timor-Leste. And John is a lead author for the most recent IPCC assessment report and co-edits the Journal of Global Environmental Change. So welcome, John.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks, David, for organising this conference. I remember well the first conference in 1997, and it's great that we have a follow-up. So I'm going to talk about something completely different, although I would love to have a conversation about migration in the Pacific, but I won't. I want to talk about political economy, markets, adaptation in Australia. And I think that we are starting to see some very interesting developments in the way markets are responding to climate change, and I think we're starting to see some interesting social justice outcomes of that. We are seeing markets emerge for the purposes of adaptation, and we might argue the point, but I think the Southern Murray-Darling Basin water market is an example of that. And we're seeing the way markets are responding to the idea of climate change, and the coal market and electricity market is an obvious one. But I think we're seeing some interesting things emerge in insurance markets, and I'm going to talk about these things. I'm talking about markets here as an economic sociologist might, as instruments of policy, as structured forms of exchange. And we know that they're preferred instruments of policy implementation because we believe that they're more efficient, though that's obviously debatable. I don't think we've thought very much about the way markets respond to climate change. We very much focus on the state. We very much focus on the state as a regulator or not of emissions reductions. We're not so sure about the role of the state in terms of adaptation, which I think is largely a public goods problem. And we haven't thought much about markets at all in terms of adaptation. This is all contentious, but it would be good to start a conversation about this, I think, and that's what I want to try and do. So let me talk about three markets. First, energy markets. We know that coal is dead for a range of reasons, one of which is technological innovation, social practices. We have 1 million households with solar panels, and that's great. And actually, it's a very interesting turn. If you read people like Tony Patt basically say the commons framing probably didn't really help us get very far with reducing emissions, but technological innovation and harnessing technology with consumption has really driven a revolution in energy. So markets actually have been a reasonably powerful dynamic for decarbonisation. And it's a logic of accumulation, and it's very interesting. There are some social justice implications of this change, though. So we have these rural communities in Hunter Valley, in the Latrobe Valley, in Port Augusta, who are put there to mine coal and produce electricity as part of a nation-building state. Those people there, they are the descendants of people who were created in these locations, made very heavily dependent on these economies for the purposes of building this country. And they've been left behind. Demand is declining, Governments have been very slow and reluctant to assist those people to transition and to assist their economies to transition, and really it looks like a political spin rather than a genuine effort to assist those communities with economic restructuring. They're being left behind, and that seems unjust. We have this other interesting paradox emerging where households that rent and low-income households who don't benefit from investing in renewable energy, don't benefit from solar panels and solar power rebates, they may be increasingly left to pay for the cost of maintaining a grid that fewer and fewer people are participating in because they're getting their solar panels and their batteries and withdrawing. So the cost of grid maintenance is going to fall on a smaller number of households who are those least able to benefit from the efficiency gains and those who are most vulnerable. So what do we take from this particular form of market response for adaptation and social justice? Well, if the renewable energy revolution is any implication, there may be scope for innovation and new technologies for adaptation. It's interesting to think about. What are the gadgets? What are the things that will generate new economies that help us adapt? Is it CFC-free or solar-powered air conditioning? Is it demountable houses? What is it? Housing design and those kind of things. But this too may affect a shift in the locations of production. There will be some social costs and adjustment as some forms of industries rise and fall. Climate change is a structurally driving form in our economy, and it's going to have the same socially driving effects. And the benefits of those innovations for adaptation will accrue to those people who can invest, who can capitalise, and they won't accrue to those people who probably most need to be the recipients of those technologies. It's interesting things to think about. Air conditioners in rental homes is another example. So let me talk to another market, the Southern Murray-Darling Basin market, which is probably now the most mature market for non-urban water in the world. And it's a vast amount of very interesting literature about the creation of this market, and it is much debated, and you only need to read the papers for a week to see it is unfinished business. But it required, and the critical difference between the first iterations of the Basin Plan and farmers burning the Basin Plan and the successful implementation of the Basin Plan was taking the state property right to water and handing that to farmers. Farmers got billion dollar creation of an asset overnight. They got a property right to water, and that enabled them to begin to trade in the market. It's been very successful in many ways. There's been a shift of water from lower to higher value uses. There's significant evidence of on-farm innovation and efficiency gains. Farmers have greater flexibility to manage water-related risks to their businesses, though business management becomes very complex when you have to market your commodity as well as think about the market for your input of water. And it's enabled farm exits, so a number of farmers who had been unable to exit farming have been able to sell their water entitlements and use that to cash up and move out. It has certainly increased environmental flows because the Commonwealth is a major holder of water rights. They have purchased water rights and they use those to make environmental flows. So let's be clear here that the Commonwealth has enabled increased environmental flows in the basin, not so much through regulation, but by acting as an actor in the water market. The Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder is the largest holder of water in the Murray-Darling Basin. It holds a property right that it can buy and sell. It's very interesting. There are some social justice implications of this change, and this is why Barnaby Joyce doesn't like the Basin Plan and he wants to unpick it, and this is why it's okay for the New South Wales and Queensland and Victorian governments to kind of not really implement the Basin Plan, because many rural communities feel that they are being left behind as well. You commodify water, it flows to capital, it doesn't flow to social goods. So we're seeing problems where collective irrigation infrastructure is becoming increasingly hard to maintain because the farmers who contributed to the maintenance of that collective good, many of them have left, and so the cost of maintaining the infrastructure falls on a smaller number of farmers. Farmers who are selling out their entitlements are exiting rural communities, and this is hastening rural decline, which then hastens problem about service delivery, keeping the schools open, and so on. We're seeing potentially some very interesting forms of the rise of agribusiness. So there's some literature around Loxton in South Australia where firms are coming in, they're purchasing land separate from water, they're purchasing water at the optimum time, and they're importing labour, and they're reconstituting manufacturing in a very large-scale Fortis mode of production. Carrots you eat come off 1 or 2 farms. And this is displacing local farms, it's displacing local workers, it's creating some tension in those communities as well. And so other values of water are being excluded by design as well. They can only be secured through the market relative to the purchasing power of irrigators. So property rights, once they're established, are hard to reverse. And if property rights can't be reversed, then the scope to allocate water for Indigenous water values, for environmental values in an era with declining runoff due to climate change, or for community values is completely limited. It is only possible through the market. Very difficult now for the state to regulate water because it's in a market structure. Efficiency is unrelated to fairness, and the water market is efficient, but it is not fair. Water markets value water for its productive use, water flows to capital. It doesn't value water for its cultural uses or environmental uses or anything else. So we're in a really different future now in the Murray-Darling Basin. So efficiency can contribute to adaptation insofar to a certain degree, and that's good, but it's only going to get us so far. And after that, we're going to need to plan, we're going to need to regulate, we're going to have to make significant trade-offs in the sectoral allocation of water between irrigation and environmental values, or between rural community X and Indigenous community Y. But our capacity to do that now has been significantly eroded by turning the allocation of water over to a market structure. And we're not going to be turning that back. Third example of a market, insurance markets. We talked about uninsurable risks and uninsurable subjects, and I think we had a critical moment in the Lockyer Valley of floods in this country where after Roma was flooded, the major insurers said, we're not going to insure any household in Roma anymore, unless you build a levy bank around the town. So the Queensland government had no choice. They came in, they built a levy bank around the town. So insurers are starting to say, we might just not insure people in this country anymore, and the state is having to come in and build a form of infrastructure that is probably maladaptive to ensure that those subjects remain insurable. This, I think, is the very thin edge of what's going to be a very long and sharp wedge. It suggests insurers will not insure some people in places exposed to higher risk, and we know the risks are growing. And we know that most of the people living in the really high-risk locations, particularly flood locations, are some of the least well-advantaged members of our society. Governments may be induced to underwrite premiums or pay for engineering works as flood levees or seawalls, or to engage in some quasi-state private market structure arrangements as happens in the US, or to raise generalised flood insurance levies. The insurance market will change. And the game, I think, is going to change, and all of this will lead to social divides between people who have insurance and people who do not, people who can recover from disasters and people who cannot. So we need to watch these markets very carefully, and I think this is a very large empirical research subject for anybody who's very interested. So what are my conclusions here? It's not just climate change per se that threatens to increase inequality in Australian society, it's the way institutions like markets respond to climate change, the way they see risk, the way they see opportunities, the way they work back onto regulators, and the ability of the state to regulate that to maintain social justice and to protect public goods into the future is going to be complicated, not just because the environment is changing, but because all sorts of market actors are changing in all sorts of ways. So we have communities whose economies depend on coal mining and coal-fired power, who are also exposed to higher bushfire risk, who are losing their jobs and who may be uninsurable into the future. What about them? We have farmers on soldier-settler schemes all around this country where the agroclimatic zones in which they're farming are changing, where they can no longer purchase water because they don't have enough purchasing power in the market. What about them? So I don't think we're going to solve this problem. I think this is an unfolding issue about the way institutions respond to the idea and the risks and opportunities of climate change. I'm not an anti-market advocate here, but I am going to suggest I think that to work fairly and to move into the future, we're going to need something like a Pollyannian counter-movement where the state suddenly takes markets much more seriously and where there's a lot more social regulation and public regulation of the actions of markets if we're to maintain some degree of fairness and prosperity into the future. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, both of you, for your presentations. There have been a lot of different chairing styles of these conversations, and I think I might ask one question of each of you and then open it up to the floor. We have until 5:45 in this session. And Chuks, I guess that one of the points that you've been making is about how the polycentricity of the Paris Agreement may work in some ways to undermine equity. And you were in the session that we had this morning. And I guess what I would like you to comment on is whether or not you do see the new transparency mechanism and the global stocktake provisions with pledge and review as supporting equity or undermining equity. Do you see that there's any relationship between those types of mechanisms and equity?
I actually had a slide on that, but I ran out of time.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, I think what I have found is a conundrum, actually, a dilemma. So a lot of initiatives start off not accommodating equity. And then when you put extra layer in order to ensure that these initiatives can become more reputable, they end up making the whole initiative a bit more convoluted, thereby disempowering the people who do not have resources to actually play a role. One good example of this is, for example, the gold standard in terms of sustainability reporting. So it was all about environmental reporting and economic reporting, and there was a lot of push in order to accommodate equity principles. But the accommodation of equity principles in that reporting now meant that reporting has to be a bit more convoluted, a bit more complex, which then meant that developing country NGOs, for example, are unable to actually track it and make sense of it. And so there is this argument by some of my colleagues in Oxford that, well, don't worry about the so-called new pledging regime, the so-called, again, bottom-up, because there's going to be a groundswell of activities that NGOs are going to rise up and begin to challenge states and hold states to account. And that's going to increase the democratic accountability globally. Well, no, on two fronts. Number one, this results in the proliferation of a lot more activities, which actually means that transparency and legitimacy are very difficult to track. And number two, NGOs who have more resources, especially in the North, are the ones that are actually able to play a major role. For the disenfranchising developing countries. So I think no.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, John, also for your presentation. I think just perhaps for our international visitors to explain to you that part of the water reform process, which we've had in Australia, is to separate water access entitlements from the land so that they are, where they used to be granted with the land, they now are separated from the land and they can be traded. Not entirely freely, but they can be traded in and of themselves. And of course, the sort of political jargon and conversations about these rights is that they are property rights. Until 2011, where the High Court of Australia actually said that for as much as politically farmers and so on and irrigators have been told that their rights are property rights, that strictly legally speaking, the High Court says, please, obviously people are using them as property rights and they're raising mortgages and all of those sorts of things as they would use their land, but strictly speaking that they are actually, not property rights in the legal sense. So, but nevertheless, it has empowered people to say we have these property rights which we're going to use in the market and so on. But I guess, John, that from my perspective as a lawyer, if we think about principles of adaptive management and so on, we're sort of thinking about this continual cycle of assessment and, learning by doing and then reviewing what we're doing and so on. But, what's happened to the legislation with this idea that we have trading to actually achieve natural resource outcomes? And I'll just give you 3 examples, is that when the National Water Initiative came out in 2004, there were immediate legislative changes. The one was to convert a water license that would only last for 15 years because of the adaptive management, ideas, would be reviewed after 15 years. Immediately, the law was changed to make them rights in perpetuity. So in other words, that they could only be divested from the holder if there had been a breach of the law. Say, for example, The other one was that all of these entitlements hang off water sharing plans, which are legislative instruments. And these instruments would only last for 10 years, again, because they should be reviewed. Straight away, the law changed to say that the minister could roll these plans over for successive 10-year periods so as to support the so-called property right in the license. And then the third was to say that the right to bring an application for judicial review challenging one of these plans would be limited to 3 months only. So if you didn't get your challenge in within 3 months, then that would be the end of it. And so this is very much a lawyer question, I know, but it's kind of how do you reconcile these sorts of immediate changes to the law with the principles of adaptive management?
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered your own question, surely. that all those structural changes, and I think people who study this from an economic point of view and a resource management point of view say we are undermining our capacity to manage the basin through climate change. And in fact, climate change isn't very well written into the basin plan, as far as I understand it. So property rights may be not legally true, and it's interesting you say that, but politically, absolutely, I suspect it's not going away. And I think the underlying point about what I'm getting at, and I think this is just one example of that, is that if we don't have really significant transitional strategies for rural Australia, we are going to be locked into these sort of, walking forward ecological, social death kind of situations the more the climate changes. And, it's interesting, and you look around and you go, well, where are the good examples of sort of structural transitions that are just and that are fair, that show the state is really committed in this country ever? Where are they anywhere in the world, actually? But that's the future that we're looking at if we're going to have to try and get past these situations. Otherwise, we're going to get into these extreme trade-offs and nobody's going to win.
Okay. Okay, first at the back and then at the front here.
Thanks very much. The question's to John, really, I think. My name's James, James Goodman. I'm very much also very attracted to using Polanyi in terms of the extent to which climate change forces a socialization process. But Polanyi, of course, in analysing that process in the 1930s, was talking about the right and the left. So the socialisation process can come in that schema from either end of the spectrum, and it does make me wonder about what the future may hold in terms of thinking about alternatives to commodification under climate change. So.
Yeah, I think it is just on the right and the left issue. And I think I'm not sure how much we can use Polanyi today, but I offer that as a way of thinking about the role of the state in terms of markets. But I think one of the interesting things, I've been doing quite a few trips into Northern Australia and North Queensland, is that at some level most people don't want to buy into the idea of climate change, but they really do want to buy into all sorts of other opportunities that climate change prevents. Renewable energy across Northern Queensland is a huge thing. National Party is massively keen on this. Bob Catter is a massive advocate for renewable energy, which sort of is an interesting thing, that kind of consumption dynamic is almost bipartisan. That's not really regulation, but it does sort of suggest in some ways climate change does cross left and right borders. I mean, the million households that have solar panels are not all voting green, right? And I think this concern for rural decline, you read the articles about the by-election in Tamworth, it does drive a concern for collective action, it does drive a concern for community, it does sort of stimulate a form of socialisation where people are thinking about their future and they're thinking about water and they're thinking about drought and so on. So I think the interesting thing about climate change is in these sort of really practical ways, it isn't really left or right, and it may drive all sorts of forms of socially driven regulation that are novel.
Great, thanks.
Kerry Harrison, John, you talked about the fact that markets are efficient but not just. But I'd wonder if you comment on the fact that that's not incidental but intrinsic to the workings of markets. And if you take insurance markets as example, for instance, the way insurance markets work, so if you can't get insurance or it gets more expensive in a higher risk area, which happened on the Sunshine Coast in flood-prone areas a few years ago, housing prices go down. So poorer people buy them, and that's seen as efficient and adaptive because when they're damaged, insurance companies pay, like if someone is killed, the payout is based on loss of earnings. So poor people have lower forecast earnings, so the insurance payout is lower, the insurance payout on the house is lower. So from an economic perspective, that's portrayed as adaptive change to climate change by forcing poor people into the high risk areas. It's not an accident that it's unjust. It's by design that's unjust.
Well, I agree with you. The problem I have is, don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are economists, so I have to recognise that markets can be efficient. But in the context of insurance, there's even a debate that insurance is actually efficient, and that in fact insurance may be completely maladaptive because it underwrites risk, and because insurance premiums are spread across an area rather than according to an individual's risk-taking behaviour or risk-mitigating behaviour. That it actually pulls risk in a way that increases the likelihood of risk-taking behaviour. But I mean, I agree with you entirely. Insurance efficiency is not fair, and markets don't care about being fair. That's not what they do. That's why we have a state. It's supposed to care about fairness, which makes you wonder why they go and create markets.
It's also a comment about insurance. Gordon Walker, Lancaster University. Insurance is surprisingly interesting. I never thought I would say that. But it's particularly interesting in Europe, and this is perhaps a slightly more positive tale. In the Netherlands, you can't buy household flood insurance. The state is an absolute guarantor because there is such vulnerability to flooding in a country that's largely reclaimed from the sea, that they've taken it on as a state obligation to protect the entire population, which is interesting to think about in terms of sort of future dynamics. And then in France, they have a principle of solidarity that runs through the insurance. You can buy household flood insurance, but it's the same for everybody. There's no differentiation on where you live. It's reflected in house price, but nothing else. It's not about location, and the principle is that everyone contributes to the vulnerability of others. So there are some other ways of organising insurance, both within and outside of the market system. So I suppose it's just a comment to say there are other ways of doing things, and you don't have to necessarily see the deep unfairness that can be in a very strong differentiation according to risk and location.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I don't know so much about land use planning in France, but the Netherlands certainly do land use planning to manage flood risk. We don't. We have no flood risk and land use planning are strange bedfellows in this country, so that may be a difference. But there is a positive story about insurance, and I think it's actually a Warsaw mechanism story. I guess, and Petra Chuckett and I have done some thinking about this, that we're not going to see a lot of progress on compensation for irreversible non-economic losses. But I do think we'll see a lot of innovation around insurance as an adaptation mechanism. And the Caribbean disaster insurance scheme is held up as an example, and the small island states really pushing for one of those. And that's been actually catalysed or enabled, and I think there's a lot of interest in that, because of the Warsaw mechanism, actually. And I think we will see a lot of diffusion and innovation, not just firms, but also perhaps community-based insurance schemes. We'll see lots of interesting agricultural insurance schemes, perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa. And that, I think, is really, really exciting. So it isn't necessarily all bad.
Let me just say a word about insurance, because this really throws up the point I was making about with the burden sharing obligation hasn't been watered down, and with basically no progress or traction with litigation, we've now moved to this green growth. And within this green growth, there's also this insurance mechanism. And the UN actually is pushing